For many years, my parents said that we'd take a road trip out to the Grand Canyon, but it was always qualified with the phrase, one of these years. Eventually I got the smart idea as to ask when one of these years would come about, and off we were in 2012, winging it around the country. We ended up going over 8,000 miles across 25 states in 28 days, making it from North Carolina all the way to San Francisco and then north to Portland before turning back. The next year we collected many of the states that we hadn't on the previous trip, and even went into Canada, as far north as the snowy Canadian Rockies. 2014 saw us go to the northeast, which wouldn't have been nearly as memorable save for the fact that we managed to have our brake catch on fire in Nova Scotia, in a small Acadian fishing village called Cheticamp, where everyone spoke French. But their English was better than our French, and we knew practically everyone in town by the time we left. So at this point we'd seen all 48 states, and the 9 Canadian provinces that you can access by paved road. After so long on the road, there were still places on the continent to go, yet the choice was more than obvious. Even after traversing the West once again in 2015, we knew where our biggest journey ever would have to take us. We were going to the last frontier. In a different car, mind you. The one that had served us well was out of commission, having suffered more than its fair share of breakdowns. My parents, who had lived in Alaska in the late 1980s, often spoke of its beauty, and family that visited them agreed wholeheartedly. But that was all well before my time. And to really understand a place, you can't take a plane. You have to go the long way. If you plug in a route from the middle of North Carolina to Fairbanks, let's say, you'll find that there are plenty of roads that seem to run due northwest, but this means going through West Virginia. We'd done that before and weren't too pleased about starting off an already harrowing journey with such a harrowing and mountainous state, so we instead found ourselves in Bristol on the Tennessee-Virginia line. We ate at the last place that Hank Williams Sr. was seen live, and then visited the ballpark of the Bristol Pirates, where a minor leaguer apparently once struck out all 27 batters of the opposing side. Our next stop was Cincinnati, which is a really neat place. Kinda rainy, though. We had lunch at this interesting establishment called Taste of Belgium. They're really serious about waffles. Who knew? Right down the road was the Great American Ballpark, home of the Cincinnati Reds, who had a statue of Johnny Bench outside, which my mom proceeded to act like she was kissing. There were plenty of people around, but few saw what she was up to, and those few didn't really care at all. Next up was the William Howard Taft Historic Site. As it turned out, the president best known for getting stuck in a bathtub never actually got stuck in a bathtub. He tried his best to combat perceived American imperialism while being the governor of the Philippines, and to date was the only president to also be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which he liked a whole lot better than being president. Western Indiana is home to a sleepy town of 15,000 called Crawfordsville, home of the Lew Wallace Museum, honoring the Union general who, while most famous for writing the novel Ben-Hur, was a Renaissance man who wrote prolifically, read voraciously, sculpted and invented various gadgets, made violins, and fished, just to name a few. His secluded study is a wonderland of architectural design. After stopping at the home of the Independent League Normal Corn Belters in Normal, Illinois, we worked our way to Rockford, eating at a place called 15th and Chris. The burgers were pretty good, but the real highlight was being in a small documentary that was being filmed at the same time. It was there that we learned that just down the street was Bayer Stadium, home of the Rockford Peaches. We had to make my mom run the bases. The next day's drive was uneventful as we cut through Wisconsin towards Minnesota, through an area of the state that seemed too desolate to have so many drivers who drove with such abject impunity towards life, liberty, and property. It's one of those places so dull that even the locals seem to throng to the tourist traps. But we had to find something to do, so we pulled off in the town of Maulston to a storefront of the Car Valley Cheese Company, where we found some candies named after my mom, and my dad and I had a little too much fun on this cow. Our last full day in the contiguous United States for nearly a month was upon us as we hit the road bound for Minot, North Dakota. Doing so meant working our way past derelict towns with unusual names that seemed deserted for everything but the fact that there were still people there. This is the Scandinavian Heritage Park, which honors the, Scandinavian heritage of many folks in the Minot area. It's a beautiful place to walk around, so long as you don't get too freaked out by the troll figures, or get crushed by a Dala horse, the national symbol of Sweden. I don't know why this one's 30 feet tall, but I'm not in a position to question such things, either then or now. Our route out of the United States took us through Portal, which is a small town on the border, although as we learned, most of the folks who work there don't live there, but choose to commute from Minot, which I can't even imagine. Usually our journeys through customs aren't all that difficult, especially when getting into Canada. Typically it's the American guards who give us the most trouble. This time we had a shotgun, and it took an extra hour for us to be dragged into an exam bay and have the Canadian agent attempt to unpack the three-dimensional puzzle that was our hatchback. Once my dad explained that we already had oil changes scheduled and we had reserved them 6 months in advance, there wasn't nearly as much concern from the border lady. When it comes to road trips, we're what you call experts. We do this for a living. We got to Saskatoon that day, and despite the best efforts of our GPS trying to kill us, we managed to find our way to a Canadian brew house, which is, a Canadian chain that fuses the dark, sports TV-dominated lighting of a Buffalo Wild Wings and the waitressing aesthetic of a Hooters. Canada is certainly a different place. It's not just the slightly different storefronts, subtle maple leaves everywhere, or usage of kilometers. There's an overall atmosphere to it, especially as you get outside the big cities. It's close enough to the United States that travelers don't get culture shock, but it's different enough that you might be inclined to think that you woke up in some kind of parallel universe. Also, our cell phones stopped working, and since they relied on location data to determine time zones, we had to calculate back from Central Time just to set our alarms in the morning, and we would have to do this until we returned to the contiguous states. One of our longest drives, up until that point on the trip, took us from Saskatoon through North Battleford and its Walmart, where we got some Alaska highway supplies, Lloydminster, which lies on the border between Saskatchewan and Alberta, and then Edmonton. We could tell we were getting further and further north, because the sun continued to stay perched above the horizon, even as the time crept later and later into the night. We got to Whitecourt, where the first of our oil changes was scheduled for the following morning, where we ate donaires at a place called Liberty Donaire, which is, it seems like a very American name. But the donaires were good, so I'm not going to judge. The little town of Valley View, Alberta isn't a whole lot to write home about, save for one thing. Its gas station bathrooms. Well, the gas station in general, which was more like a general store. They even had salesmen outside who sold my dad some really high-quality cleaning liquid for about half price because, let's be honest, when we have our trip beards, we don't look like we're going to shell out big bucks for some organic cleanser. But that was not the highlight of the day. That was to be found at the town of Dawson Creek, mile 0 on the Alaska Highway, a route built in an astounding 8 months during World War II over theretofore uncharted terrain. It was known as the ALCAN during its time as a military project, gaining its civilian name when maintenance was turned over to the Canadian government. It's a route so desolate that it was only paved fully in the 1990s. But as we come to learn, paved is used as a very loose definition on the Alaska Highway. Dawson Creek also exploded in the 1940s. Literally, someone forgot to properly store their dynamite. Don't you hate it when someone forgets to properly store their dynamite? Dust and grime and dirt are ever-present forces of nature on the highway, and we anticipated more desolation than we got. It turns out that the southernmost portion of the road sees a ton of use between Dawson Creek and the larger city of Fort St. John, which was our destination for the night. After a long stop where we all got a bit goofy in the car, we went downhill slowly. The steep slope is technically called Taylor Hill, but it's a mountain to any good North Carolinian. That ended in a metal grate bridge, after which we officially made it to Fort St. John, which is kind of an industrial-looking place. The first full day on the Alaska Highway was kind of dreary. The temperature never went out of the high 40s, Fahrenheit, y'all, and it was kinda rainy too. The road goes north to Fort Nelson before taking a left and sneaking into the mountains. The road to Fort Nelson was monotonous, but once we began working our way west, the beauty really opened up.
We've just come down from Summit Lake Pass, and we are down here in the valley looking at the Canadian Rockies all around us. Snow-capped peaks. The river is just getting thawed out. Some ice still in the river, and the Summit Lake is still frozen. We had a little bit of snow on us that turned into rain when it hit the windshield, but it was like flurries coming down. 49 degrees for us, but at altitude it's a little higher, a little colder. Clouds are.
We spent the night in Toad River, British Columbia. Toad River Lodge isn't just the only game in town, it is the town. But they've also got over 10,000 hats, and we added one of our own to make 10,783.
Turn around and we've got a microwave, TV, Wi-Fi, refrigerator. We've got 3 beds. It's a good paneled little cabin, and look at the bathroom. We're out here in the middle of nowhere, and we've got a bathroom.
I also spotted this moose, which went right past our cabin.
Get him. I got a video. Oh, wow.
Yep, still beautiful. The geography teems with waterways, and we went around and across an uncountable number of creeks, lakes, rivers, and streams. Thankfully, few metal grates were to be found, save for the longest bridge on the entire Alaska highway into Teslin, Yukon. The most interesting thing about the highway's route is that it zigzags into the Yukon and back out a total of 7 times, with the 7th its final entrance into the territory. On the 5th border crossing, the Yukon government places its sign, for the first community in the territory is Watson Lake, whose biggest touristy claim to fame is the signpost forest, started after a lonely GI made up a sign for his hometown and posted it. It now has around 80,000 signs. The Yukon Road was rougher, certainly. There were gravel breaks and potholes and frost heaves, but we managed to get through each and every last one of them. A long day on the road got us all the way to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon. The Yukon is a place that one expects, well, I don't know what kind of food exactly, but Asian fusion isn't the first guess I'd venture. The moose was frozen, but that didn't stop my dad. Most Whitehorsers are from elsewhere in Canada or the world, so it makes sense that you have some degree of culinary authenticity. So we're here in Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon Territory, and we're in the Sky Hotel, and it's quite a nice place, save for one particular feature that we find rather amusing. Everything of importance in this room, and indeed everything of importance in this entire hotel, is slanted. Take a look at this. Down here, we see, perfectly normal, Yukon hotel room, but take a look under here. Yes, that's right. The internet connection port, which fortunately we do not have to use because we have Wi-Fi compatibility, as well as 2 regular power outlets, are slanted towards each other, no less. Now, moving right along, the door itself, as you may be able to tell, at the very bottom, is slanted. My personal favorite in this entire room is the bathroom, and if we come to the sink, square-shaped, eco-friendly, turn on this a little bit, it's quite nice. It's slanted. It's all slanted. It gets bright early in the Yukon that time of year, and we needed to have a day on the town to make up for the brutal distance of the day before. The first stop was the Yukon Transportation Museum, which has a DC-3 as a weather vane. Fortunately, most of the museum was indoors since the wind was so cold, and the lady at the front desk let us in even though the museum was technically closed that day. The museum tracks all transportation used in the territory, and we had some fun. Our next stop was the McBride Museum of Yukon History, which was mostly under construction, but the part that was open was still pretty interesting. Lunch was at Klondike Rib and Salmon, which is contained within one of the oldest buildings in Whitehorse. I had a burger which combined bison, elk, and wild boar meats. It was a lot.
This is really good.
Your thoughts?
Did you get the burger at all? I thought it tasted good.
It's very interesting. The rains came on and off, but we weren't going to be denied a little more sightseeing. Whitehorse might be the biggest thing the Yukon has to offer, but it's still a pretty small town by most people's standards. I was expecting something a lot more rough and grimy, but it really surprised me. Not so much as some other places on the route would come to offer, though. When we'd first crossed the border into the Yukon, we'd learned that the roughest roads always lay between Whitehorse and the Alaska border. There was also rain, again, but we did know that our return would actually take us along this little section of the road again, so the clouded peaks didn't bother us. Once we passed Haines Junction, where the road to Haines, Alaska splits off, we were headed along the rest of the ALCAN, bound for Tok. Alright, let's flash back about 30 years. You know how I said my parents lived in Alaska for 2 years? Well, they decided to take the ferry to Haines and drive the rest of the way, so they've been on this little section before, and as much as they remembered hating the road, the one place they thought was a true hell on earth was Tok, a place where the only hotel was an extremely seedy bar. Understandably, they weren't really thrilled about the prospect of going back, much less spending the night in Tok. The route towards Tok was very pretty, though, with some of the most unique scenery of the entire journey. At long last, our time had come. We braved the potholes and the gravel breaks and the frost heaves. We'd driven thousands of miles. This was state number 49 for me, and yet our journey was only beginning. This was not at our northernmost or westernmost. We weren't done for the night. We weren't even done with the Alaska Highway. We had to press on to Tok, and 2 out of the 3 people in the car were severely distressed. Tok was actually kind of nice. It's a small little town, and there's only really one place to eat or sleep or really do anything. But when you're on such a remote corner of the continent, it's leaps and bounds better than one might expect. This time they didn't witness an owl going through anyone else's windshield either.
The plumbing is kind of cool. The orange pipe goes all the way up and over, and it's the sprinkler system. So that's kind of fun.
They say that everything's bigger in Texas, and I would humbly submit that Stetsons and 6-shooters have nothing on grizzly bears and midnight suns. After one of the largest breakfasts I've ever seen and the second biggest chair I've ever seen, it was time to finish what remained of the Alaska Highway, which has its northern terminus in Delta Junction, which is kind of anticlimactic since the route basically continues in a different name to Fairbanks. Of course, there's no commemorative marker that we've ever been able to keep ourselves from desecrating in some way. To get to Fairbanks, you have to go through North Pole, which is a town that functions solely on year-round commercialization of Christmas. So we started here.
Yeah.
We're currently there. It was at this moment, in the North Pole Alaska Welcome Center, that I realized exactly how far we'd driven. This is the face of a man who laughs in the face of the overwhelming reality of what he'd prodded his family into doing over the better part of a half-decade. We ate at a Chinese restaurant that Guy Fieri had once gone to, and then into Fairbanks, where the rain that had dogged us cleared out, and we went to Creamer's Field. You don't really expect marshes in Alaska, but there's this gorgeous wetland there. Sometimes the trail got a little bit slanted, but we managed. If there's one place in Alaska that I always wanted to go, it was the Arctic Circle. And for the life of me, I don't know why. I think just the sort of remoteness of it, and the fact that most people don't even know you can drive there, was an attraction. Either way, we were all going, much to the consternation of my mom, but we weren't sacrificing our vehicle to the perilous Dalton Highway. We took a tour van. Our driver was named Mike, and he had a Scottish accent despite being from the Alaskan bush and eating bear all his life. This is the man Ron Swanson wants to be when he grows up. Next to him was Clark, who looks almost exactly like my friend Isaac's dad. The two other families on this bus were both older couples, one from Louisiana and the other from Chicago. The Dalton Highway was the other character on this journey, and I can't say many nice things about this road. The scenery is nothing special, and the fact that it exists solely for industrial purposes is very apparent. We crossed the Yukon River on this slanted bridge, and pressed north as the weather got worse and worse. But we were told that it rarely ever rained the Arctic Circle itself for some reason. Now, you're probably wondering, why didn't we just bite the bullet and go all the way up to Prudhoe Bay? Well, the only reason to endure any more of the Dalton Highway than what takes you to the Arctic Circle would be if you wanted to take a dip in the Arctic Ocean. But the oil companies charge you upwards of $50 a head due to safety concerns. In my opinion, we gave plenty of money to those same oil companies through our frequent gasoline purchases. Anyway, we made it to Finger Mountain and then finally to the Arctic Circle, which was a gloriously welcomed sign. The road north lay before us, but we were happy to be on the road back to Fairbanks, or as it happened, 17 miles north of Fairbanks, when we ran out of gas. We were stopped for about an hour until one of the local bush people could come by with a few gallons of fuel, but because of the company, it turned out to be not nearly as bad as it sounded. Upon returning to Fairbanks, we ate at this place called Big Daddy's Barbecue, which served as what might be the best barbecue anywhere in the country, which is a strange and kind of sobering thought. I suppose the ultimate moral of this story is that you might go into an experience thinking that you're going to get a certain thing out of it, but in the end you end up getting something completely different out of it, and that's okay. Turns out that the memories upon which you look fondly back are not the memories you expected to make. As long as you're okay with that going in, you can have a lot of fun. As it turns out, sitting down for long periods of time is surprisingly tiresome in its own way, but our remaining time in Fairbanks was short, so we spent the day around the University of Alaska campus. The first stop was the Museum of the North. Next, we headed out into the wilderness paths around campus, and we got kind of a bit lost, but it was all in good fun. The trails kind of jiggled due to melted permafrost below them, and my dad really kind of wanted to have a moose sighting. So much so that he did whatever this is. My mom, on the other hand, was having her own fun. The mosquitoes are just as bad as everyone says they are, and we were fortunate enough to have enough blood in our systems to make it back to the car. Fairbanks, in the end, had treated us well. You can't go to Alaska and not go to Denali National Park. It's kind of a heresy. On the other hand, there are few words which can capture the kind of majesty that park contains. We started up a trail and we proceeded to lose it once we got halfway up the mountain because there was so much snow.
Average river trail, most strenuous in Denali. It's in the low 30s. It's been snowing at 6 to 11 inches of snow over there.
That's the trail right there.
We're going to go through 2 or 3 inches, 4 inches of snow. 4-mile trail.
See how much snow this is? Let's see. Next to fix Dad's feet. It goes all the way down. Well, that's more than 4 inches.
That's more like 8 right there.
We even ran into a Ukrainian couple who didn't speak much English, but to whom my mom made several Star Wars references anyway. To get away from this awkwardness, we went up the side of the mountain and ran into a pack of Dall sheep. One of the most interesting restaurants in the census-designated place of Denali Park is the Salmon Bake, which is not up to any building code because I don't think they have building codes. Alaska is a very libertarian place in a lot of ways. The food was good, though. They say that only about a quarter of visitors to the park actually see what they call the mountain. We didn't, but as the snow came and went, we saw a ton of things that most people don't, like this black wolf. The only way to get any significant distance into the park is to go on a tour bus, which drive up and down the 1.5-lane totally gravel park road. It's a little harrowing, but you get used to it. You could make an entire vacation out of Denali, and I can't blame anyone who does. But we were bound to see more of the last frontier. Our first stop was Talkeetna, which is kind of a hippie village. If you've heard of Talkeetna, it probably has to do with its non-human mayor, Stubbs the cat. Stubbs was apparently in retirement when we got there, which only makes me wonder how long he's actually been dead. Outside of Palmer is Hatcher Pass, which contains an abandoned mine. My parents took my grandmother and great-aunt here 30 years ago, and not a whole lot has changed since. Except when they went, there wasn't so much snow on the ground. "Oh, it's going to be late May," we said. "We're not going to need to pack our snow boots," we said. Well, tell that to my eternally frostbitten shins, thank you very much. Our stop for the night was the Knik River Lodge, which lay at the end of a surprisingly long road. The cabins were quaint and in some regards high-tech.
We have an automatic kind of stove here, but it's by thermostat, so we don't have to poke it and keep it clean, keep it going that way. Kind of a space-agey shower for such a rustic cabin. And like a heater thing there on the wall.
It also turned out to have simply the best food we had anywhere in North America, and we even ended up meeting the chef. Even the buffet the next day was good, and as it turned out, we'd come to need the energy. We headed down to Eagle River, where my parents both began openly marveling, in a state somewhere between shock and stone-cold horror, at the sheer amount of population growth in the greater Anchorage area in the past 30 years. Every street, every extra lane, every shopping center, every road, and every new stoplight saw one of them say in hushed tones that wasn't there before. Our sights were set on a trail that they'd never done, going into the Eagle River Valley towards Eagle Lake and Symphony Lake. They say this is an easy hike. They say it's relatively flat. They say it's only 5.5 miles one direction, and none of these are correct.
Here in Eagle River Valley, South Fork Trail, May 28th, 2017. I'm your host, David Little. Along with me is Thomas and Ann Little. We're hiking this trail, which is going to be a 10-11 mile walk all around. There's my one Kenobi.
The rains saturated the ground, so a good chunk of our time was spent avoiding stuff like this. Determination and grit kept us going through unideal conditions. Negotiating a massive pile of boulders at the end of all that wasn't safe, so the most we could see was Eagle Lake. The food was dog trash, but it was high in calories and located close to our hotel, so we weren't ones to complain. We had one full day to spend in Anchorage, so we went out to Earthquake Park, where the vegetation has grown up to the point that you can't really see a whole lot of evidence of the infamous 1964 earthquake. The river turned out to be not much to look at either. I ate a meal with 2 salads, and we tried to get to a lookout point called Flat Top, only to have our directions try to take us up a 17% grade. We were going to the town of Whittier, which is unusual for a few reasons. For one thing, all of its residents live in one big building, and you can only get to it through a 1-lane tunnel that also serves trains. This is the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, and it's interesting to drive.
And it is a train track down there, and we're trying to avoid it as Thomas drives skillfully through the tunnel.
It's the tunnel.
This is the longest such tunnel in North America at 13,200 so feet. We're going to Whittier.
Just on the other side lay a steep trail which led to an overlook of Portage Glacier, and it was one of the more rewarding hikes because it actually turned out as advertised. Whittier's a neat little small town, and driving through it takes almost no time. After lunch, we headed back out through the tunnel and on to the westernmost point in the North American highway system. We saw mountains from 50 miles away, as well as this bald eagle, which was significantly closer. Anchor Point contains the aforementioned westernmost point, which turns out to be apparently Kylo Ren's RV park. Kind of anticlimactic, but I'm glad he found something to do after the sequel trilogy. We stopped for the night in Homer, which is unique for its long spit, which really and truly marks the end of the road. Fresh seafood? You bet. I even learned to like scallops. This was the view around 11 o'clock. Unfortunately, at around 6 o'clock the following morning, I got violently ill. Within a few hours, I had to be admitted to the emergency room due to fears of dehydration. Somehow, I'd managed to get norovirus. It was supposed to last 24 hours, but we had reservations in Seward. We were going to see whales and glaciers in Kenai Fjords, and a little gastrointestinal distress couldn't stop me. We ended up driving to Seward that night, arriving near midnight, just as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. Kenai Fjords was worth it. I didn't have any solid food for about 5 days, and the nausea medications came in handy on the boat, but what sights! Afterwards, we retraced our steps to Girdwood, and specifically a place called the Double Muskie Inn.
Does it give you a feeling better? You like the bread?
My dad has raved about this place and their shrimp étouffée specifically for as long as I can remember.
It's happiness.
Being around food was about as much as I could handle at the time. I don't have many rules in life, but one of them is this. If you're in a ski town, and you've got free passes to a ski lift, you take the freaking ski lift. Well, it's actually an air tram, but it goes really far up. After Girdwood, we finally made it to Flat Top, this time the right way, not up that 17% grade. We didn't hike the full trail because I basically had no energy whatsoever, but this was the closest we got to seeing Denali. Even shrouded from distance and clouds, it was still enormous. The road back to Tok is not too bad until you get to Glen Allen. I don't know who Glen is, or who Allen is for that matter, but the road from there to Tok was one of the worst maintained sections of so-called asphalt in the state.
This is the Tok cutoff, ladies and gentlemen. It's a 7% downgrade.
Mile 21.
There have been more decent gravel breaks than there have been regular pavement sections, seemingly. I'm just coasting. Here's our intrepid driver. Here's our intrepid navigator.
Hello.
And I'm your cameraman.
The mostly unpaved Dalton Highway was in some respects better. After all, that's an industrial road. It's honest about what it is. When you drive to Alaska, all roads lead to Tok. But there's not just the Alaska Highway. There's another road north, the Taylor Highway, from which splits the Top of the World Highway, the northernmost land border crossing on the continent, and pretty dang remote. The Taylor Highway has a road surface that looks for all the world like a quilt, and was paved until our final approach towards the town of Chicken. Chicken has 7 people, and this gigantic metal statue. It's not even given the vaunted status of unincorporated community, it's a census-designated place, right alongside crossroads with derelict roadhouses. Yet looking at the sprawling Chicken, after all there's lots of room to grow in the middle of absolutely nowhere, one would think that it has several dozen people. Each little patch of the town claims to attract viewers with an authentic chicken experience, and these patches include Chicken, Downtown Chicken, Chicken Historic District, and presumably you could find fried chicken if you squinted hard enough. The disparate parts of Chicken are held together by virtue of it being a tourist trap of a gold rush town that never quite died off, and I'll readily agree to the fact that it has some level of unique charm to its slanted storefronts and its wind-swept latrines, all watched over by one great flightless metal beast of a bird who cares not for who might rightfully claim the disputed title of Original Chicken. There wasn't much to look forward to on the route towards the Yukon border. The road was a smoothed-over disaster, and there were still active miners and prospectors in the region.
Getting off the jackway disaster.
And the gravel's still on the side of the road. This was so good.
Pavement never felt so sweet. This was officially called the Boundary Spur Road, and how this was the nicest blacktop we were on the entire trip baffles me. But it didn't last long. The pavement ends again at the Yukon border. The Top of the World Highway was originally built by the American military as an overland route to Dawson City, and for many years was the only way to get there by vehicle. Since they were pressed for time, they went over the ridgeline instead of snaking through the valleys below. It's dangerous, sure, but the views are breathtaking. The final descent took us toward Dawson City, which is technically the town of the city of Dawson. But we were on the other side of the Yukon River and had to wait for the George Black Ferry.
We are on the George Black Ferry, crossing the Yukon River.
In the middle of the Yukon. Look down
We
there.
are on the ferry currently. And yeah, we're just kind of floating in the Yukon right now.
Yeah, no big
Chilling
deal.
out.
I just cannot believe we are over the top of the world.
And it shows us on my little map here that we are indeed in the middle of the Yukon.
Letting the current turn us.
Yeah.
Dawson City is not large, but what it lacks in size, it makes up for in its pristine Gold Rush quirky adorability. Well, except for our hotel room.
Hello, and welcome to the Aurora Inn in the town of the city of Dawson. This is our bathroom. You'll notice the angled shower, the very low but very unique octagonal sink with plenty of accoutrements, double everything they usually put in the hotels. Tiny little heater here. You have to bend over significantly in order to turn the knob. Follow me. Speak, Dada. Yes, this is the chair of Papa Elf. As are the beds. You'll see how wide they are to the ground, but they look super, super comfortable. Now there's a little corridor, and there's another little separate little bedroom area. And this is where Thomas gets to sleep tonight. Hope you've enjoyed this tour of the Aurora Inn in the town, the city of Dawson.
After some food, we walked around the town, something that really doesn't take long at all.
Hey, we're in Yukon in Dawson City. It's June the 3rd, 2017. We drove top of the World Highway. On top of that, we're in the middle of a street and nobody seems to care.
We saw Robert Service's cabin, Jack London's cabin. You can really see who made more money as an author. And this twisted church. In the pantheon of wondrous roads that the Northwest has to offer, the Klondike Highway cannot rightfully take its place among them. It was chip-sealed all the way down, with promised gravel breaks that never materialized, but unpromised potholes that did. Swerving to avoid them and scanning for wildlife were perhaps the only things to do for much of this drive. In Alaska, such a route would doubtless pass through tiny communities or hermit families with trash strewn about their claims, but the Yukon is fundamentally different in that there was just flat nothing but forest and a single line of telephone poles running for miles and miles on end. Aside from the occasional community, there was not much of note until we approached Whitehorse once again.
The yump. It's very soft. And furry like me.
We had some Mediterranean food for dinner, and I was a little goofy, I think. At least I actually felt like eating.
Say what you said.
I'm God.
Now, what you must understand about the day's journey, and basically since we left Carmack's, was that my dad was entranced with the idea of eating a Tim Hortons maple donut. He got his donut.
Let's do it. Let's go to Hayes Junction.
We knew what we were in for, the worst gravel breaks on the Alaska Highway. But this time there were clear skies, and instead of continuing up through Destruction Bay towards Tok, we took the road to Haines, and this turned out to be one of the best drives we had so far, as road conditions were concerned. Haines itself, though, sadly I can't say too much. It's a sleepy town where even the people at the visitor center don't know anything about their little community's most notable historical landmark. And none of the food was really good either. So we are here, waiting in line for the Alaska Marine Highway boarding on the Malaspina. Dad, how does it feel to be in Haines, Alaska?
Well, we've survived the putrid mess of squalor known as Haines. We've eaten a meal, if you can call it that I wouldn't feed a praying mantis. On top of that, we went to another place to have a meal that was, while it was slightly better, I have seen possums that look more attractive as roadkill. It's pretty bad.
I'm just be glad to get out of here. It's not so bad. It's just a pathetic little place. Has a lot of potential. It all goes to the library. Library's nice.
Would you like to have a beautiful little mint from Alaskan Resort?
Yes, I have nothing else to live for.
While waiting for our Alaska Marine Highway ferry, my dad got, well, moose mating call in action. We packed into the MV Malaspina and settled into our cabin for several days of much-needed rest. "11:45 was our arrival time for Ketchikan, which proved the most promising port of call for those wishing to stretch their legs on terra firma. It's now a very touristy place, what with the massive cruise ships and all, but still a really neat place to walk around. There are a lot of totem poles, too.
Welcome to our cabin. It's a 4-berth stateroom facing out. As you can see, we look out of the ship on the front. There's nobody in our front. Occasionally somebody shines a bell up there, but they don't pay attention. Got ladders that we can pull on and off, put under the bed, but we use them to get up here. I sleep here. Thomas sleeps here. Got these fun little lights you can turn on and off, right here. Mom's been sleeping down here. Been using that as our extra stuff place. Kind of a cozy little cabin. We got a thermostat that doesn't work, but we've been having fun trying to make it do things. Here, you push water down, and it goes, and it turns itself off. Very efficient use of water. Let's go outside now and see what we see. Follow me on the tour. On the left, you can see the Great Seal of Alaska. It greets us every morning as we leave. Here's the big commercial station. Now we will head up. This goes to the front of the ship. We can look out, taking several pictures. And left and right, we can go outside and upstairs. Towards the back of the ship used to be a bar, but they closed it. Cafeteria. The most important part of the stay is where you eat. Notice the artwork here. You're a good at it. We just passed the movie theater. That's it.
For the first time since Minot, we awoke with cell reception. The contiguous 48 states were in sight, and we were set on going to Olympic National Park, the only remnant of the old-growth rainforest that used to be everywhere on the west coast thousands of years ago. Getting there involved yet another ferry, but at this point dry land felt weird, and I sometimes found myself rocking back and forth in time with invisible waves. We stopped for the night in Forks, which is most famous for being the setting of the Twilight series. We stayed at a motel with a Twilight-themed room, but thankfully our room was not Twilight-themed. The mere existence of such a thing vaguely disgusts me. Olympic National Park covers nearly the entirety of its peninsula, and for good reason. We went to the Hoh Rainforest, and I know it's a rainforest, but it was weirdly green. Like, too green. There's almost an overload of green, and everything gets so much rain that it's just straight up saturated. It's a fairy tale jungle.
Feel this stuff. It is like uber. It's like wet.
Oh, that's weird.
It is wet.
It's soggy.
That's what moss is. Moss is usually pretty soggy.
Like little trees on here.
I say boy. No, that's chicken, isn't it?
Soon after leaving, though, the norovirus struck back. I spent some miserable time at a latrine near Ruby Beach, and we ended up doubling back to the hospital in Forks. I felt quite a bit better by the time that I got there, and by the time they'd run their tests, I actually had an appetite again, which was weird. Tacoma is the home of the AAA Tacoma Rainiers, and we'd not had an opportunity to collect a pennant in a while, which is one of the things we like to do on road trips. After my mom and I managed to get one, as my dad deftly avoided overzealous security guys, we somehow wormed our way out and vowed never to return. The traffic was just that brutal. We spent the night in Spokane, where we'd been to on our very first mega trip. We ate at a place called the Rusty Moose, and in 2012 I did this. So I recreated it.
Cutie. Oh, it's a sweet boy, that's right.
We also lip-synced to a certain 80s song about everybody having fun tonight, but I can't play the audio because of copyright reasons. For the rest of the trip, there wasn't a whole lot to do. We focused on eating regularly, which meant fewer local places and more sub sandwiches and Culvers once we got back to the Midwest. This wasn't so much by design as it was by necessity. We spent nights in Bozeman, Montana, in Gillette, Wyoming, South Dakota, and then through Vermilion, South Dakota, where I went for the second time in my life to the National Music Museum. From there, it was on through Iowa. Not far from Iowa City is West Branch, home of Herbert Hoover. It's easy for history to judge Hoover for his inaction in the face of the Great Depression, but the truth resists simplicity. Hoover was known as the Great Humanitarian for his actions as a private citizen in providing food relief to Europe during World War I. He believed that the generosity of the wealthy would be enough to help the economy, since that's what he himself had done. The more one learns of his life and the circumstances of his upbringing, the more one understands him as a deeply moral, yet ideological person, and not simply that terrible dude who let the economy tank.
It's Daniel.
Our route home took us through Indiana. After a brief stop at the home of the Indianapolis Indians, who didn't have a pennant in stock, we turned south. And on our route south, every restaurant was closed. Why? You can't drink the water. Add on to our famished bodies and prospect of some of the most hideous stretches of interstate highway, and it wasn't fun. Eventually we made it to Lexington, Kentucky, and spent the night in Winchester. The next day, we returned home.